In this video, we will take a look at fixed and relative addressing in macros. Okay, so we opened up our Bernard Baruch macro, and in this particular workbook, we still have our macro that was recorded. And if you go to the Developer tab and go to Macros, you will notice that that macro is still available to be executed if you wanted to run it. However, we're now going to run another macro, but before we do that, we're going to have to record it. Before we record it, we're going to look at this option here that says Use Relative References. And we're going to click on that Use Relative References, and when we do that, you'll notice that that particular option gets highlighted. At this time, we're going to click the Record macro, and it's going to ask you for a macro name, and we'll call that Bernard Baruch Relative macro. And again, you can put an underscore or a dash or anything you like. For the shortcut key, we'll do Control, and I'll hold down the Shift key, and we're going to use the letter R, and we'll store it in this workbook, and we'll click OK. At this time, we are actually recording our macro. So I'm going to start in cell L6, and again, I'm going to type in the name that we had used before, and at this time, I finished typing, and I'm going to go 2 cells down below the middle name. I finished recording my macro, so I'm going to stop recording. And at this time, I'm going to try to run my macro. So in this place, I'm actually staying in M8, and I'm going to try running it. And if you notice what happens, it starts in M8, fills in the first name, middle name, last name, just like I had asked it to do. And it then goes 2 cells below, which is what I had asked it to do when I recorded my macro. Let's try running this again, but let's run it from cell J10. When I run it from cell J10, notice that it starts in J10, gives me the first, middle, last name, and goes 2 cells down below. So no matter where I go on the spreadsheet, so if I go to cell M40 and I run this macro, it is running it relative to where I am starting to actually execute the macro. And this is different than the macro that we had prior, which was the fixed type macro. And if we go now to the developer and we go to macros and we go to the Bernard Baruch macro and we run that, notice that it always puts us back in the same location that we had recorded the macro. And this is known as a fixed or absolute type addressing macro, because it doesn't move from the location where the macro is recorded. With the relative recorded macro, when that's being executed, it doesn't go back to the location where it started initially the recording of the macro, but it actually will run it relative to the position where you are asking it to execute. So that's the difference between a relative executed macro and one that is using fixed addressing, such as the initial one that we started out with. And again, if you want to have a relative reference macro, in that case, you have to make sure to choose Use Relative References. And it's always a good idea when you are finished recording and you have completed what you wanted prior to saving your macro, it's a good idea to uncheck that so you will remember to go back to change it to relative references if that's what you wanted the next time you go into this particular macro. So again, I simply can save this macro, and it will have the names of the two macros that I have recorded, one being the fixed macro and the second being the relative addressed macro, which will record and execute relative to the position from where I am asking it to execute. Okay, so that's the two types of addressing that we can use in Microsoft Excel when recording macros.